I'm Haley B. Miller, and this is Ohio Politics Explained, a podcast where you give us 15 minutes and we give you all the news you need to sound smart and impress your friends. Welcome back to Ohio Politics Explained. Today, we're breaking down Governor Mike DeWine's State of the State address and what it means for the next state budget and DeWine's legacy. We'll also discuss a Supreme Court case involving a Columbus pastor and the latest message to Ohio universities from the Trump administration. With me on this lovely fake spring day is Jesse Balmert.
I'm here for seeing the sun until 7:30 p.m.
We say like we're not in a dark room right now.
Yes.
Let's start with DeWine's State of the State, the second to last of his time as governor. Since this is a budget year, DeWine used a lot of his speech to tout his top priorities and urge lawmakers to support his budget proposal. He talked a lot about how he wants to help kids, think driver's ed, a child tax credit, and vision screenings and glasses. DeWine also wants schools to ban cell phones, which is a step further than the current policy, that basically just limits access. What else stood out to you?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. He started with a number of kind of economic business deals that the state's been able to make in recent years. He spent an okay amount of time on Intel, which I thought was interesting given the kind of financial situation and up in the air. Intel recently, it was supposed to be opening around 2025. Now that's been bumped back to 2030 or 31. So I thought that was interesting.
He mentioned Intel last, and for a while I was like, oh man, is he not going to mention it? But it did eventually get brought up.
Did make an appearance. I thought, to your point about cell phones in schools, banning them entirely was a step further than where we've been. I think that's something that Governor DeWine has wanted to do. It's also something that the candidates for governor to replace him have been talking about, Vivek Ramaswamy and Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost as well. I think the only concern about that from folks is if there's an emergency, will kids be able to contact parents or so forth? But I think there really has been a push towards removing cell phones from the classroom in recent years. He talked about different parts of the budget, funding for sports stadiums, which is, kind of controversial with the Cleveland Browns not being such a winning team.
Yeah. So this is DeWine's last budget, which I think we've talked about before. And he really is in legacy mode at this point. He has less than 2 years in office, and the budget is going to be the last really meaningful way that he can kind of shape the direction of the state for the near term. What is your sense of, are there hills he's going to die on, do you think, with this budget?
It's interesting. I think you see a lot of projects that he wants to fund, things like the glasses for school children. He really wants to focus on, teaching kids to read, which Ohio's reading scores are getting slightly better, but are still not where they need to be. I think that's true nationwide. Reading scores and math scores were pretty dicey on the latest national report. So I think those are things that he's going to focus in on. His budget did not include an income tax cut. It also didn't really include any property tax relief. And I know those are things that Ohio lawmakers are interested in. Meanwhile, Ohio lawmakers are not that interested in some of the tax increases that Mike DeWine was talking about for tobacco or sports betting or to be determined marijuana.
Yeah, it's interesting because I do think, like you said, there are these pet projects that DeWine wants to fund, and you need money to do that. And DeWine has made it pretty clear that he doesn't think the state needs to further cut income taxes. He thinks, they've done a pretty good job making Ohio competitive for businesses, and that's not the complaint that he hears. But lawmakers are really into it. We've heard that come up in the governor's race now. So I'll be curious to see what happens if that comes across his desk. I mean, he has signed past tax cuts, but at this point we have 2 tax brackets, so there's not much left to whittle away.
Yeah, I think something to be on the lookout for is if we're going to get to that flat tax, so everyone pays the same tax except for if you're exempt under a certain dollar amount. One other thing from the state of state was we got a little bit of insight into what Lieutenant Governor Jim Tressel is going to be doing. He's being tasked with Ohio's workforce playbook. We used a lot of football metaphors in this particular state of the state, but that also includes bringing jobs, but also preparing Ohio's workforce of the future. They even talked about doing some sort of physical fitness training for kids in schools. So I think we still have to kind of flesh out what Jim Tressel's role is going to be, but we've got at least an indication.
Aside from speaking at Lincoln Day dinners, which he's been doing a lot of.
Yes. So I think he's slated to speak at a few of them, which is always a good indication that you might be interested in governor. We'll see if he actually jumps in against Vivek Ramaswamy and Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost, but it keeps us guessing.
Our next topic is a pretty interesting Supreme Court case. Former Columbus pastor David Thompson is taking his case to Ohio's top court after he was convicted of swindling his congregation out of $1 million. This conviction was all the way back in 2010. Why are we here 15 years later?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's a little convoluted, but he was sentenced to prison time. Then he was basically on probation, a thing called community control, and it got kind of tossed back and forth. And so he's saying that he doesn't need to do like an extra 5 years of community control in addition to what he had already done. He also was required to pay back some of the money that he stole, and I don't think all of that happened. So it's something that the Ohio Supreme Court justices could sort out in the coming month or so.
It'll be interesting to see how they ruled, if nothing else, for like the implication in, similar cases. I've heard of community service, and I know that's part of his community control, but I'd never heard that term before our colleague reported this.
Yeah, it's every case right now is really interesting with this new Ohio Supreme Court. There's only one Democrat on it, but also like how are the conservative justices ruling on different cases. So it's a good way to just see where they're at philosophically.
Let's wrap up today with a new message from the Trump administration. Ohio State and the University of Cincinnati were among dozens of schools that received letters warning that they will face consequences if they don't protect Jewish students. What's the backstory here?
Yeah, so this is in response to a couple of complaints that were filed at the universities. Ohio State's is still pending, and Cincinnati's was actually already resolved in December. What's interesting is there are other universities in Ohio that also had complaints, but they are not on this list. And so it's a little confusing kind of how this came about. And then also the enforcement of these concerns about anti-Semitism is going to be done by the U.S. Department of Education, which on Wednesday received a large number of cuts. And so it's hard to say how much this will be enforced.
And a lot of these complaints stemmed from the protests on campus in response to the Israel-Gaza conflict, correct?
Yeah, if you recall, last summer, right before schools were breaking, there were a number of protests related to that conflict on university campuses really across the nation, and just kind of how that response was handled was the subject of a lot of debate, criticism, etc. I do think that Republican lawmakers in Ohio felt pretty good about how Ohio State handled it and how they were able to disperse the crowds, but I know that there were people within those protests that were, not satisfied with how it was handled.
Yeah, and as you alluded to, universities are just getting a lot thrown at them right now. Department of Education just cut a bunch of staff. Ohio State, University of Cincinnati, others are trying to figure out what these directives from the Trump administration mean regarding DEI programs. We've seen Ohio State, for example, cut some of its offices or plan to cut some of its offices in response to that. So just a lot going on that front right now. And I would make a plug for our colleague Sheridan Hendricks, who covers higher ed for the Dispatch and definitely has her hands full right now.
Yeah, there's a lot coming from the feds. There's a lot coming from Ohio lawmakers with this Senate Bill 1, which has a lot in it, is still pending. So how they're responding to that, whether they're making changes before they're required to, is all the subject of a lot of scrutiny and a lot of attention right now.
And one more thing before you go. If you haven't already, be sure to check out our special episode about Ohio's dangerous dog laws. Our colleague Laura Bischoff led an investigation that found Ohio fails to protect people who were maimed or even killed by vicious dogs. You can also read all of the stories on our websites.